Thank you for being here this morning and being part of our worship service. It's so good to have all of you with us. And at all of our campuses today, because it's Communion Sunday, it's also Elder Fund Sunday. The Elder Fund is used to help people in our church, in our communities who run into a crisis and need help. And so if you'd like to give to the Elder Fund today, cash or check made out to the church, there's ways to do that in the back of all of our campuses and venues. Here at the Gaylord campus, at the main auditorium, there'll be elders at the back as you leave with offering plates. If you'd like to give to the Elder Fund, just put it in there. And of course, regular giving can be done in the giving boxes, as well as regular giving and Elder Fund, both done online. Also want to welcome all of our first-time guests. We'd love to connect with you. And in front of you at all of our campus, there is a ticket. Would you please fill it out? When the service is over, up at the Sioux campus, take it to Jeff up in the back. He would love to be able to connect with you. Here at the Gaylord campus, I'll be out in the hub after the service by the cafe. Bring it out to me. I'd love to connect with you, spend a little time chatting with you, and give you a gift bag. Our way of saying thank you for being our guest today. Well, this morning we want to continue our series we're calling The Long Road Home, as we're studying the life of the Apostle Paul from the end of his missionary journeys through the end of his life. And just to kind of catch you up to speed, Paul went to Jerusalem. There a mob attacks him. They would have killed him had the Roman commander, Claudius Lysias, not intervened. He goes through some trials there in Jerusalem. Claudius can find no crime that he's committed, and Claudius is in a very difficult situation because the Jews want him killed, and if he doesn't give them what they want, they will riot. His job is to keep peace. If they riot, he'll lose his job. But at the same time, Paul's a Roman citizen. And it was illegal to punish a Roman citizen who had not been condemned of a crime. So Claudius is in a tough spot. But he finds a way out when he hears about a plot to kill Paul. So under the cover of darkness, he sends Paul to Caesarea, about 60 miles away, in order for the Roman governor, the procurator named Felix, to try him. And when Paul gets to Caesarea, Felix says, I will give you a hearing as soon as your accusers come down from Jerusalem. So now as we pick up the story in a moment in Acts chapter 24, Paul now begins a 2-year time period where he's under arrest in Caesarea. During this time period, he will have trials before 3 Roman dignitaries. Felix the governor, then his replacement, Festus the governor, and then finally in front of King Herod Agrippa II. So in chapter 24, we're going to see today his trial before Felix. Now, before we enter the courtroom and we see the trial, I want to give you some background information on Felix, some history that will help you to really grasp what's going on in the courtroom and how this whole story ends when we get to the end of the chapter. So there are 4 things I want you to know about Felix. Number 1, his position. He is the Roman proconsul, the procurator of Judea. We would call him a governor. That's simple. He is the governor of Judea. Now, he is the one who succeeded another Roman governor of Judea that you're probably more familiar with. His name was Pontius Pilate. And it was about 20 to 25 years earlier than Acts 24 that Pilate sentenced Jesus to death. Well, Felix is the one that comes after Pilate. So there's no question. He would have inside information about the whole crucifixion of Jesus. He would certainly have been privy to the rumors that had gone around that Jesus rose from the dead. That's Felix. Now, the second thing I want you to know about Felix is this. He is the most unique governor of all the Roman governors in history, and here's how. He is the only Roman governor who at one time himself had been a slave. He actually had been a slave. It was the Emperor Claudius that gave him his freedom. So how does an ex-slave become the Roman governor of Judea? Well, as is often the case, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And it was Felix's brother, who was very popular and powerful in the Roman court, who was able to finagle a way for Felix, the ex-slave, to become the governor of Judea. Now, the third thing I want you to know about Felix is this. He was, by every stretch of the imagination, a bad dude. I mean, he was bad. His reign as governor was known for two things: corruption and cruelty. He was brutal. He was known to often use excessive force, a lot of bloodshed, a lot of death within his reign. In fact, it was Felix who at one point actually had the Jewish high priest killed. That doesn't go well with the Jewish people. That's Felix. Felix is driven by a lust for three things. And every decision he makes is back to these three things. He is driven by a lust for sex. He is driven by a lust for power. And he is driven by a lust for money. And we'll see that as we look at this trial today. Now, there's a fourth thing I want you to know about Felix. I want you to know about his wife, because she will be mentioned later in the chapter. Her name was Drusilla. Now, Drusilla was, by all the standards, and history records it, an absolutely beautiful lady. She was drop-dead gorgeous. And remember Felix, who's almost 40 years her senior. Felix is driven by a lust for sex. And one day Felix gets a look at Drusilla. And at the time, she was 16 years old. Felix would have been about 40 years old or older. And when he sees her, his passion kicks in and he wants her. Now, there are two problems. Well, there's many problems, obviously, but let me give you two more. One is this. At the time, Felix was already married. In fact, it was his second marriage. Because Felix's track record was, as soon as I find somebody who's more physically appealing to me than you, I get a new wife. That was his track record. In fact, his second wife, who he was married to at the time, was actually the great-granddaughter of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. But he was tired of her. He saw Drusilla, who at the time was 16 years old, and he wanted her. So he divorces his wife. The other problem was Drusilla also was already married. She was married to a lesser-known king of a small kingdom in Syria. It was a politically arranged marriage. She was not happy in her marriage at all. So here's what Felix did. He hired a Jewish sorcerer in order to go and, using his propaganda, lure Drusilla away from her husband. So this 16-year-old girl divorces her husband and marries Felix, who's almost 40 years older than she is. Now, by the way, it wasn't just a passion for sex that drove Felix in this area, but also a passion for power. Because Drusilla was part of the Herodian family line, all the Herods. In fact, Drusilla's father was Herod Agrippa I. That would have meant that Drusilla had an intimate knowledge of this thing called the Way. Christians were called the Way because they followed Jesus, who said he was the way, the truth, and the life. She had an intimate knowledge because it was her daddy, Herod Agrippa I, who would have been the one who had the apostle James killed. He was the one that had the apostle Peter imprisoned with the intention of killing him, had not God sent an angel to open the jail cell so Peter could get out. Her great uncle was Herod Antipas, who ordered the head of John the Baptist to be severed from his shoulders. And if that wasn't enough, her great-granddaddy was Herod the Great. He was the one, you might remember, that at the time of the birth of Jesus had all of the babies 2 years and younger in Bethlehem slaughtered. She was not only drop-dead gorgeous, she came from a very influential and a very powerful family. So, one more thing to note about Drusilla, it'll be in the text, is this. She was Jewish. She had a Jewish heritage somewhere in her line. As a result, she would have had some knowledge of the Jewish law, the Jewish customs, the Jewish religion, and even the Jewish hope of a coming Messiah. She would have been privy to that information. So with all of that as a historical backdrop, let's now enter the courtroom. And let's see what happens when Paul stands trial before Felix. Let me begin reading in Acts chapter 24 and verse number 1. And here's what it says. After 5 days from what? When Paul first arrived in Caesarea. And Felix said, I'll hear your case once your accusers get here. 5 days later, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders, some of the Sanhedrin, some of the Jewish rulers, along with an attorney named Tertullus. And they brought charges to Governor Felix against Paul. Now notice, the Jewish hierarchy who desperately wants Paul killed, they don't just come down on their own. They hire a lawyer. His name is Tertullus. He's obviously in the text going to associate himself with the Jews, so he's Jewish, but he has a Roman name, which tells me he is what we would call a Hellenistic Jew, a Jew who has adopted the Greek culture. Now, he's a lawyer. Don't let that throw you. That doesn't mean he was going to argue the law. That's not really what the word lawyer insinuated in that day. It simply meant this. He was a silver-tongued orator. He was a great communicator. And that's why they bring him. And it's important, and here's why. And you'll see this as we read Tertullus's summary statement to Felix. You'll see that it is very lacking when it comes to identifying crimes that Paul had committed that was against Roman law. And it was completely absent of any proof that he had committed any crimes. And it was absent of any eyewitnesses. So if you were going to go purely on a legal standing, they didn't have a leg to stand on. They really couldn't identify a Roman law he had broken. They had no proof that he had broken a Roman law, and they had no eyewitnesses. So how in the world were they going to convince Felix to execute Paul? They were going to use a common strategy of that day that was quite effective when dealing with Roman dignitaries. It was the strategy of flattery. And that's what Tertullus was skilled in. Notice what he says to the governor. Keeping in mind everything I just shared with you about Felix And all of those Jewish leaders that would have been sitting there, they know the real Felix. Here's what Tertullus says. Look at verse 2. After Paul had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying to the governor, "Since we have through you, governor, attained much peace, and since by your providence reforms are being carried out for this nation, we acknowledge this in every way and everywhere, most excellent Felix, with all thankfulness." Tertullus is laying it on thick. And I have to imagine the Jewish leaders are sitting there biting their tongue until it bleeds, because they know that's not the real Felix. Keep reading. He now gives to Felix what he believes to be the charges against Paul. He says in verse 4, "But that I may not weary you any further, I beg you to grant us by your kindness a brief hearing. For we have found this man Paul," here's accusation number 1. Ready? "A real pest." Well, that's a great accusation, isn't it? "And the fellow who stirs up dissension among all the Jews throughout the world. And he is the ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes." You might want to underline that. "And he even tried to desecrate the temple. And then we arrested him. We wanted to judge him according to our own law. We had it covered, Felix. You shouldn't even be involved. And you wouldn't be, except your Roman commander blew it." And they now shift the blame to Claudius Lysias. He says, "But Lysias, the commander, came along, and with much violence he took Paul out of our hands, ordering his accusers to come before you. So by examining him yourself concerning all these matters, you will be able to ascertain the things of which we accuse him." And then all the Jews who were there watching, they began to join in. "Hear, hear, yes, hear, hear. That's exactly right." So let's notice the accusations he makes against Paul. Accusation number 1 is this: he is a real pest. He's a pest. Now, there's no question, folks. Pests are highly annoying. Pests are incredibly obnoxious. How many of you know a pest? Raise your hand. Don't point. Just raise your hand. Yeah, if they're here, they're probably in the balcony, but that's all right. Pests are very annoying. Extremely inconvenient. No one likes hanging around the pest, but it is far from being a crime. They have nothing on Paul. They say, well, he's a pest that causes dissension. Paul will deal with that in a second. The second charge, they say, is this. Not only that, he is the ringleader of a dangerous sect of people called the Nazarenes. Now, the word sect is a word that we might say cult. It's a word that described a group of people whose thinking was outside of the mainstream. He is part of a cult who's dangerous because their thinking is outside of the mainstream. They are Nazarenes. Now, here's what's interesting. This is the only time in all the Bible that Christians, followers of Jesus, were called Nazarenes. The only time. They were called at this time followers of the way. But he says they were the Nazarenes. What's he doing? He's trying to put a derogatory spin to turn Felix's feelings bad about Paul. So he calls all followers of Jesus the Nazarenes. Now, remember, Jesus was a Nazarene, being that he was from Nazareth. The problem with Nazareth was this. It was a city no one wanted to be in. It was a city whose nickname was the city of garbage. Remember when they came to one of the disciples before he was a disciple and said, "We have found the Messiah. It's Jesus from Nazareth." Remember his response? "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And so what's this attorney doing? He's not just using flattery. He's trying through derogatory connection turn Felix against Paul. And what's the third charge? The third charge is he desecrated the temple. Now again, that was a Jewish law, not a Roman law. And if you remember, all the way back in Acts 21, that's how this whole thing started. Remember, Paul goes up into the temple area to make a sacrifice? And what happens? Let me review Acts 21, verse 27. The Jews from Asia Minor, probably Ephesus, where Paul had stayed for 3 years, upon seeing Paul in the temple, began to stir up the crowd. Question: who stirred up the crowd? Paul or these other Jewish people? The other Jewish people. Paul didn't do anything wrong. And they laid hands on him, crying out, "Men of Israel, come help us. This is the man who preaches to all men everywhere against our people and the law and this place. And besides, he's even brought Greeks into the temple." Now, that was not allowed by Jewish law. If a Gentile entered the Jewish area, he could be killed on the spot. The Romans let the Jews do that. And they say, here's the problem. Paul brought a Gentile in here. Now, did Paul really do that? No. Look at what it says. They said this because, verse 29, they had previously seen Trophimus, an Ephesian, a Gentile, with Paul in the city. So they supposed Paul had brought him into the temple as well. In other words, they're making it up. They're making it up because they want people to kill Paul. That's where the whole thing started. So he says, there's the third charge. He desecrated the temple. Number one, he's a pest that causes dissension. Number two, he's the ringleader of a dangerous cult. And number three, he desecrated the temple. Well, now, it's Paul's turn. Paul does not have a lawyer. Paul is defending himself. I think it was Mark Twain who once said, "He who defends himself has a fool for a client." And that's probably true in most cases. But not if you're the Apostle Paul. In fact, God had already promised Paul, "Don't you worry when you stand before kings. I'll give you the words to say." And when you see Paul's response, it's masterful. Now notice, it doesn't start with any flattery. Flattery means you use compliments that aren't true to gain an advantage. There's no untrue flattery. Look at it. Verse number 10 of Acts 24. And I'm going to read all the way through verse 21, and then we're going to go back and break it down. So a little bit of a long reading here. Follow along. When the governor had nodded for him to speak, Paul responded, "Knowing that for many years you've been a judge to this nation." That was a fact, no flattery. "I cheerfully make my defense. Since you can take note of the fact that it was no more than 12 days ago, don't miss this, that I went up to Jerusalem. I arrived in Jerusalem 12 days ago. Neither in the temple, nor in the synagogues, nor in the city itself did they find me carrying on even a discussion with anyone, let alone causing a riot. Nor can they prove to you the charges of which they now accuse me. But this I will admit to you, that according to the way, what they called believers, followers of Jesus, which they call a sect, a cult, I do serve the God of our fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I believe everything that's in accordance with the written law and the prophets, the Old Testament. I have a hope in God, which these men cherish themselves, that there shall certainly be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. In view of this, I do my best to maintain always a blameless conscience before God and before men." Now, regarding the third charge, that I desecrated the temple, verse 17. "Now, after several years, it had been over 20 years since Paul had been living in Jerusalem, I came to bring alms to my nation. he was bringing an offering from the Gentile churches to present offerings, in which they found me occupied doing that in the temple. That's all I was doing, making sacrifices. They found me in the temple, and having been purified without any crowd or uproar, everything was good. But there were some Jews from Asia Minor who ought to have been present before you right now to make this accusation if they should have anything against me. Or else, let these men, pointing to the Sanhedrin, the high priest, themselves tell what misdeed they found when I stood before their council. Other than for this one statement, which I shouted while standing among them, for the resurrection of the dead, I am on trial before you today. Now, this is a masterful response. Let's break it down. He first deals with charge number one, that he was a pest that caused dissension. He was causing a riot on the temple. And here's what Paul says. He says, Felix, think about the timeline. It was just 12 days ago I arrived in Jerusalem. I hadn't been there 24 hours when I'm at the temple, and these guys start a riot against me. Ever since that moment, I have been a prisoner, either under Claudius in Jerusalem or under you here in Caesarea. When did I have time to cause dissension? I mean, as soon as I arrived, I got arrested. And he says, they can offer you no proof. They can offer you no proof that I caused any dissension at all. Not only is there not a legitimate crime that I've committed, there is no proof that I did anything wrong. And then he moves to charge number two. In regard to me being the ringleader of a dangerous sect, the Nazarenes, let me tell you what is at the basis of my belief system. Because these Jewish council members are saying that my belief system is not part of the mainstream thinking, which makes me dangerous. Well, here's what I believe. I serve the God of the Jewish fathers. I serve the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The same God my accusers serve. I believe the Jewish scriptures. Guess what? My accusers believe the Jewish scripture. And I believe in a future resurrection from the dead. The same belief that many of my accusers, the Pharisees in the group, also believe. So here's what Paul's saying. If my thinking is dangerous, if my thinking is outside of the mainstream, if I deserve to be punished for that, so do they. Because they believe the same thing about those things. This is a masterful response by Paul. And then he deals with the third one. He says, now as far as me desecrating the temple, by supposedly bringing a Gentile into the Jewish area, which I did not do. Here's what Paul says. Where are the original accusers? Where are those Jews from Asia Minor that first brought the charge? Why are they not here? Now, what's Paul doing? He's using Roman law to his advantage. Because Roman law said this, if you made an accusation against somebody that resulted in a court hearing, by law, you had to be there to testify. And if you were not there to testify, you would be sought out, you would be arrested, and you would go on trial. So what's Paul saying? According to Roman law, the people who first were the supposed eyewitnesses who accused me of this are supposed to be here right now. But they're nowhere to be found, Felix. There is no crime that I've committed. There is no proof of a crime. And there are no eyewitnesses to the crime. Paul is giving a masterful response. And then he simply says this to Felix. Felix, There's really only one reason I'm here, and it's not a Roman issue at all. The reason I'm here is because these guys don't like the fact that I believe Jesus rose from the dead. That's why I'm here. That's not anything to do with Roman law. So what has Paul just done? He has just given Felix everything Felix needs to dismiss the case, to throw it out, to say, go free, Paul. But Felix can't do that. Why can't Felix do that? Felix cannot do that for the same reason Commander Claudius Lysias could not do it. Because he knows if he doesn't punish Paul, the Jews will riot. But he knows he can't punish Paul unless Paul's guilty of a crime. He's in the same situation. So he's going to use a tactic called delay. Look what happens in verse 22. But Felix, having a more exact knowledge about the way, about followers of Jesus, put them off. He put the Jewish council off who wanted Paul to be convicted. Now let me stop for a second. How did Felix have a pretty good knowledge of Christianity? Well, I think several reasons. Number one, because remember, he succeeded Pontius Pilate. He would have known all about the situation with the death of Jesus and the rumored resurrection. But also keep in mind, he's married to a Jew who I'm sure has given him even more information about the Jewish law, about the Jewish prophecies, and about the hope of a Jewish Messiah. He's got a pretty good knowledge. So he says, here's what I'm going to do. When Lysias the commander, who's up in Jerusalem, comes down, I'll talk to him. He was a witness. And then I'll give a verdict on your case. He's going to use delay. I'm not going to give a verdict now. I want to talk to Commander Lysias first. So, Jewish council, go back home. I'll call you after I talk to Commander Lysias. Now, the Bible nor history records that Felix ever called Commander Claudius. There is no record that Commander Claudius ever came to Felix to talk to him about this. He had no intention of calling Commander Claudius. Instead, he just wanted to delay because any decision he made would be bad. So in his mind, indecision is the best route. So look what he does. Keep reading. It says, then he gave orders to the centurion for Paul to be kept in custody, but yet to have some freedom because he's a Roman citizen, and not to prevent any of his friends from ministering to him. This will begin a 2-year period that Paul's in prison. He will be in prison at the palace under basically house arrest until Felix's reign ends in 2 years. Felix will not give a verdict. That's his way of avoiding a problem. Now here's where it gets interesting. Because beginning in verse 24, we're going to discover that Felix is going to spend several times having some conversation with Paul. Paul's under arrest right in the governor's palace. Many times he'll bring him in to talk to him. Now we're going to see in a moment, when we get there, that his reasoning for bringing Paul in wasn't that he was all that interested in learning more about Jesus, but rather he was giving Paul an opportunity to bribe him. Remember, what is it that drives Felix? A lust for sex, power, and money. So look what happens. Look at verse number 24. But some days later, after that trial, Felix arrives with his wife Drusilla, who was a Jewess. She's Jewish. And they sent for Paul. And Paul has a discussion with them about faith in Christ Jesus. Now again, why did they want to have the discussion? We'll learn later. They're hoping for a bribe. But Paul says, fine, hope what you want. I'm going to tell you about Jesus. So Paul's telling them about faith in Jesus, including discussing with them righteousness, self-control, and the judgment that is to come. So Paul, who I'm sure realized what he really wants is a bribe, decides to take great advantage of the opportunity to stand before the Roman governor and tell the Roman governor about Jesus. He talks to the Roman governor, it says, about righteousness. In other words, how can you be right before God? And he says to the governor, and we would know what he would say based on his other writings. He would say to the governor, Governor, for God to accept you, you must be completely righteous before him. You know what that means? You must never, ever sin. And if you never, ever sin, you would be righteous before God. Remember what Paul wrote to the church at Rome? There is none righteous, no, not one. So do you know what he says now? He says, Felix, here's your problem. Your problem is you ain't righteous. And he talks about self-control. He says it's your own lack of self-control that shows you're not righteous. In fact, the teenage girl sitting next to you is proof positive. You're not righteous. And he even talks to him about the fact that why this is important is because one day we will stand before God. And God will judge us based on our righteousness. And we will all come up failing because none of us are righteous. But he told him about faith in Jesus. He told him about what I would call the great exchange. He said, but here's the good news, Felix. God made a way for you to be righteous. That's why we're called the way, because Jesus is that way. And God sent Jesus to this earth, God in the flesh, who lived a perfect life. But Felix, when Jesus died on the cross, the great exchange began. Because you know what God did? God took your unrighteousness, your sin, and he put it on Jesus. The Bible says God made him who knew no sin to become sin for us. And then Felix, here's what God did. God poured out his punishment, his wrath on Jesus because he saw your sin and he saw Drusilla's sin and he saw my sin. And on the cross, Jesus Christ pays the penalty for our sin. That's why Jesus cries out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? As God the Father, for the first time in eternity, has to look away from God the Son because he carried your sin, Felix. Your sin, Drusilla. My sin. And Jesus on the cross, Felix, paid the penalty in full. That's why at the end he said, it is finished. There's nothing else that needs to be done. And Felix, 3 days later, to prove he was exactly who he claimed to be, he rose from the dead. And now, Felix, we must make a decision. If we will choose to quit trusting whatever we're trusting, to quit trusting our own righteousness, and instead put our faith totally in what Jesus did for us when God put our sin on his account, the great exchange continues. Because if we'll do that, God will take the righteousness of Jesus and he'll put it on your account, Felix. He'll put it on your account, Drusilla. He'll put it on my account. God made him who knew no sin to be sin for us that we might be made the righteousness of God in him. And then, Felix, when God looks down from heaven at you, when you stand before God in heaven, he will no longer see you through your sin. He will see you through the righteousness of Christ. He will be able to declare you righteousness on account for what Jesus did for you, and you will spend eternity with him. But Felix, if you reject that, then you're going to have to pay the penalty yourself. Because the wages of sin is to be eternally separated from God forever. He talks to Felix about the great exchange. Felix has the golden opportunity. But look how Felix responds. Felix became frightened. What frightened him? Well, Felix is thinking, if what Paul's telling me is true, my eternity right now doesn't look so good. But I don't really want to follow Jesus. So you know what he says to Paul? Look at it. He says, go away for the present, and when I find time, one translation says, when it's more convenient, I will summon you. Paul, go away. Drusilla needs to go do her hair. We need to kind of quit this conversation. And when it's more convenient, I'll bring you back. And it says at the same time, too, look at this. What he really was hoping for was that money would be given him by Paul. He wanted a bribe. And therefore, he also used to send for him quite often to talk with him, not because he was interested in Jesus, but because he wanted a bribe. And after 2 years had passed, he was succeeded by Festus. But during those 2 years, wishing to do the Jews a favor, he left Paul imprisoned. Here's Felix. He just hears the most incredible message anyone could ever hear. He hears about the great exchange. That Christ took our sin, and if we'll put our faith in him, Christ will give us his righteousness. And how does Felix respond? He responds by saying, not now, Paul. Not now. I'll call you back and we'll talk more about this at a more convenient time. And friends, many of you who are listening to me right now, whatever venue you're listening at, whatever means you're using to listen, TV, radio, online, whatever it is, many of you today are sitting in Felix's seat. You're sitting in Drusilla's seat. You have heard the story of Jesus and how only through faith in him can you be righteous before God. And some of you, just like Felix, are a little nervous right now. Because if what I'm saying is true, that means your eternity doesn't look so good. But you're thinking to yourself, I'm just not ready to become a follower of Jesus. I'll think about it at a more convenient time. And I would simply like to say this to you. You will never find a more convenient time to give your life to Jesus than right now. And here's why. Here's why right now is the most convenient time you have. Because right now you have the opportunity. But there's no guarantee you'll ever get the opportunity again. If you've never put your faith in Jesus, today is the day of salvation. Today is the day that you can call out to him in your heart of hearts and put your faith in Jesus. Jeff's going to take over up at the Sioux campus, the Spawnables down in the chapel. Here in the main auditorium, would you stand with me, please? Father, I am blown away by the great exchange. That you would take my sin and put it on Jesus. Wow, he did not deserve that. And that when I put my faith in Jesus, you took his righteousness and placed it on me, and I surely did not deserve that. For by grace, we have been saved through faith. And this is not of ourselves. It's a free gift of God, not of works, so that no man can boast. And I am thankful today for your amazing grace that frees us from the chains of sin and darkness and hell and brings us into your glorious light. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.